Before I get started, I want to give a shout out to all of the paying members of my Patreon channel. Your support is necessary, and without you, none of this is possible. And a special shout out to IBN Sabil for their support of the channel. And if you'd like to support the channel directly, Cash App and PayPal are available. Just be sure to let me know in the For section if it's okay for me to thank you publicly, or else I'll assume you'll want to remain anonymous.
And here we go.
Layman's Journal, Chapter 253. As I've shared many times, I'm an oops baby. I'm a zennial and all of my siblings are boomers, and my parents are from the silent generation. And while that sounds depressing, I can tell you that it's quite interesting, as one of the benefits of being a oops baby is life happens at you fast. And what I mean is, you get to see how the people around you age, and how the decisions they've made in their youth paid off as they grew older. So when I was a teenager, I knew what life was like at age 40 by living vicariously through my siblings. And when I got into my 20s, through my parents and their friends, I learned what life was like for the elderly. So I grew up knowing the potential of my future decades before I was coming into my present. And so over the years, I recognize a pattern. I can tell you where someone will be 20 years from now based on the things they're saying today. Take this woman right here. She's very beautiful, articulate, and successful. She's a fast-rising TikToker, and all of her videos are about how great life is as a childless woman, and how she doesn't prioritize men. In fact, she brags about her lifestyle, while simultaneously mocking and denigrating women who've chosen or desire a life of motherhood. Which is why I find what she says so concerning, because I know how this ends. I know what life is like when you get older, and it's not something you want to do alone. And this current situation with Don Robinson is a classic example of that.
You guys, for the past almost 3 years, I have been living in my car. Ah! I said it. Oh my God, it's out. I've been living in my car. Oh my gosh. If you remember, if you guys were with me in 2020, I did like 105,000 interviews. And in the interim, I was living with my parents in Vegas. And that was wonderful until it wasn't. I love my mom, but she became very angry. And a lot of her anger she was taking out on me, and I was her target all the time. And I was like, I can't deal with this. Like, I respect her too much. Let me get out of here. And I was sleeping in my car for maybe about a month in Vegas. And then the guy that was co-managing me at the time was living in LA, and he said, you need to come back to LA. Okay. And he said that I could stay with him. And so I was like, okay. He's like, I don't have a lot of room, but I'll make room for you. And then when I got to his place, he actually didn't have room for me. So it turned into, okay, well, I'm going to put you in a hotel for the night. And that one night turned into 8 months. Oh my God, you guys. Because every apartment that I looked at, every single time I looked at a place, I would call him and I'm like, okay, can you meet me here? I would tell him ahead of time, of course. And then he wouldn't meet me there until I would take video and send it to him. And he's like, no, oh my God, this neighborhood, I hate it. I mean, I felt like he was playing games, and I knew he was playing games, and I wasn't the one. I'm like, come on, I'm trying to make this easier on you, because financially, I know it's got to be hard. You're paying your rent and you're paying my hotel. His apartment was $1,700 a month. And then my hotel was over $3,000. Yeah. So, and I was always stressed every week because he would pay weekly for the hotel. So every week I was like, oh my God, can you afford it? Are you okay? And he's like, no, I can't, but I'm getting it together. What? You're the one who said to go to the hotel, and you're not approving any of the apartments. Like, it would be so much cheaper to just get me into an apartment. Like, what's the problem?
Now, for those who don't know, Dawn is or was a member of the R&B group In Vogue. In fact, she was the lead singer, and they were a huge hit in the 1990s, commercially and critically. Yet here she is, living in her car for the past 3 years, single, without children, with no career to speak of, at age 58. Yeah, that's brutal, and we're gonna talk about it. So, let's get it. First of all, what Dawn is currently going through isn't uncommon, as I'm noticing a disturbing trend on social media of women bragging about how great life is living in their cars. Now, to me, it looks like a mental disorder. Sleeping in random lots, using public bathrooms, exposure to unpredictable weather, etc. But they make it seem like it's the best thing ever. And so does Dawn. They use terms and phrases like liberating and exciting, when in reality it's dangerous and unsustainable. Now, Dawn was an exceptionally beautiful woman back in her day, and even now at 58, she's still attractive. And it's bizarre to me that a woman with the options that she has or has had would choose this life. And I'm willing to bet you, even now there's a man somewhere, a man that she knows that's willing to take care of her, but she instead opts to be a homeless rebel. She'd rather be out, exposed to the streets, than to come in and cooperate with a man. But even still, I don't know much about Dawn other than her career, and even still that's limited because I was in middle school when En Vogue was a big thing, and even then I wasn't a huge fan of R&B, but I do remember them being the biggest R&B group in the world during their time, and I remember her deciding to leave the group at the apex of their popularity to pursue a career of her own, which flopped by the way, as it was nowhere near the success she had with the group. As for her personal life, I know she is divorced and has no children, and as of 2016, she has a mother, stepfather, sister, and brother-in-law, and at least one niece. Now, she mentioned her mother in her YouTube video. In fact, it was her mother whom she threw under the bus. But this photo is from 9 years ago, and I'm not sure what her family dynamic looks like now. But my point is, she's well down the path of dying alone, and she's going to do so broke and on the streets. And it's shocking to see this happen to a woman of her caliber, given her looks, notoriety, talent, and career accomplishments. Yet still, this was her outcome. So if this can happen to Dawn, what does this say about other women? Millions of women. Women who aren't as attractive, talented, or successful as Dawn was. Women who brag about being strong, independent, and not needing no man. What will be their outcome? What will they be doing at age 58? Where and how will they be living? And that question is why this story is so poignant, so relevant to what's going on today. Going back to the lovely lady at the top of the video, I'm sure this is what Dawn was saying, doing, or thinking back in the 90s, when she was young, beautiful, and living a life of endless possibilities. I'm sure she didn't see living in a car in her 50s as an outcome of her decision-making, just like the young lady at the top of the video doesn't either. But it's funny how life has a way of humbling people, especially when it's coupled with time. And like I said, I'm an oops baby. I've grown up in an old family, and I've seen this play out many times. And if it could happen to a woman like Dawn, it can happen to any woman. Now, I can hear some of you in the comment section saying,
"But Layman, what about the men? Men are more likely to be homeless than women."
Yes, I know about the men, but the difference is we men know what's waiting for us, because we grew up seeing other men on the streets, and we know it's nothing nice. That's why you don't see us en masse celebrating this, acting like living in your car is the best thing ever. But we've never seen women living like this, because the women of previous generations didn't die alone, which has allowed them to be guarded from this type of outcome. But Generation X is a whole different breed. They've embraced living alone, dying alone, and they wear it like a badge of honor. And it's for that reason I believe we're going to see a lot of Dawn Robinsons in the future. So I'm going to let those be my final thoughts, but before I go, please check out my latest video on Patreon. It's an in-depth breakdown of the film Revolutionary Road. Here's a preview. Layman's Journal Chapter 251. 1950s America is affectionately known as the Happy Days. It was a time of economic prosperity, military dominance, and cultural homogeny. And our neighborhoods, as well as our urban areas, were safe, and our schools were excellent. It was also the apex of American manufacturing, so there was no inflation or stagflation, no outsourcing of jobs, or importation of cheap immigrant labor. So it was easy for a man coming straight out of high school with nothing more than a diploma to find a great paying job. And by the time he was age 23, he would have a house, a car, a stay-at-home wife with 2 children, living comfortably on just one salary. And speaking of families, we had a baby boom, the largest in American history. And it was primarily because work was so readily available for men, so it was easy for them to marry and start families. It's also worth mentioning that we were morally grounded at that time. Church attendance was high. And when I say church, I don't mean the modern church, because this was a time before the prosperity gospel, before we had multi-million-dollar pastors with billion-dollar ministries. They didn't focus on motivational rhetoric or gynocentric talking points back then. They were real churches who had a real focus on God and the Word of God. So we didn't have baby mama, baby daddy culture in our communities. Women married before they carried, and most were virgins when they married. And they stayed that way because this was a time before we had no-fault divorce. And again, that's why it was called the happy days. And that's the way it was for our parents and grandparents. I say parents because, as I've shared before, I'm an oops baby. My parents married in the 1950s. My dad was 34 and my mom was 18 when they wed.
What?
That's right. My daddy married an 18-year-old virgin.
My man.
But getting back to my point, my siblings are all boomers, and I'm a zennial. So when I was coming up, they were all grown and out of the house. And my parents stayed married until my father's death 60 years later. And again, that's the way they did things back then. Most of my parents' friends were also married until death. I can only think of two in particular that were either divorced or raising children alone. My point is, it wasn't common. And as a result, children grew up well-adjusted. The psychological, behavioral issues we have today weren't present en masse back then. But the kids weren't the only ones that were okay. The adults were good too. People back then were not abusing alcohol or narcotics like they do now, and women were not addicted to antidepressants. And men didn't struggle with pornography addictions. So yeah, those were the happy days. But they weren't perfect. Radical prejudice was at an all-time high in the 1950s. Blacks were treated as second-class citizens, with limited protections under the law. And while America as a whole was doing well, blacks as a whole were not. Now you had enclaves in cities like Detroit and other areas throughout the Rust Belt where black people were prosperous, but overall, we were locked out of the economy, particularly in the South, where most of us were relegated to sharecropping and other forms of low-wage work. But then the tumultuous 60s and 70s came around, which brought about change, and that had its pluses and minuses as well. On the positive side, it made systemic illegal, so blacks across the nation could partake in the American dream. But it also ushered in second-wave feminism, also known as the women's liberation movement. Because of programs like affirmative action, women were able to advance in the workplace, allowing them to become financially independent from men. You also had the welfare system, or the Great Society, that allowed women to raise children as single mothers. And they were given birth control and the right to children, which incentivized a pursuit of their careers, as well as an embrace of promiscuous culture. But more importantly, they were given no-fault divorce and a family court system that ruled heavily in their favor. All of this made marriage an antiquated form of survival for women, because now they no longer needed men to sustain them, which on the surface seems great. Women got their liberty and economic freedom, but it marked the beginning of what we now recognize as the gender war, where women went from being our helpmeets to our rivals. And the results have been devastating. Generations later, the divorce rate has skyrocketed, marriages have plummeted, and birth rates have taken a sharp decline. And of the children that are born, 40% of them are being brought up in unwed homes. And it's led to a push, a return to traditional values, to get back to the happy days of the 1950s, when families were strong and enact. This, of course, ruffles the feathers of the modern feminists, who rail against traditional values. They hate the concept of a nuclear family and see the 50s as a dark age for women because they'd rather have their independence, careers, antidepressants, lonely nights, and cats than husbands and well-adjusted children. In other words, they're in open rebellion. And to make sure America never returns to the days of stable family structures, they've resorted to revisionist history. And many, like Alice Walker, have created false narratives with stories like The Color Purple to illustrate what life wasn't like for black women in nuclear families.
Nobody. Look at you. You're black, you're poor, you're ugly, you're a woman.
You're nothing at all!
Yeah, they created demons like Mr., who treated women like property, causing black women today to believe that feminism and the sisterhood are their only saviors, that traditional values are about enslavement. Which brings us to Revolutionary Road, the subject of today's video. Again, be sure to check that video out. It's some of my best work. And while you're there, check out the rest of the videos in my Patreon library, as I'm sure there's something there you'll enjoy. And that's it. That's all I have to say about it. What do you have to say about it? Leave a comment in the comment section and let's have a conversation.
How am I spending my Friday? Some jerk chicken with rice seasoned, red beans and some bread. Got some red wine over here. And I'm watching Layman's Journal on YouTube. Shout out to the brother Layman. Check him out. I'll leave the link in the description. It's your boy Calvin King. And this is how I'm enjoying my Friday.